Okay, oh, got some more people coming. Well, all right, let me see who just joined us. It's
Jean.
Hastings 4.
Yeah.
Oh, is it Ann or who is it?
Well, I just joined Jean Stinnett.
Oh, it's Jean. Okay, hello, Jean. Good to see you.
Hi.
I want to introduce a friend of mine that I invited. Her name's Penny Greer, and Penny and I are on a board together for Nebraska Interfaith Power and Light. It's a nonprofit that tries to address issues of climate change and certainly climate denial for those. But Penny, I'm glad you're here. You want to say a few words about yourself?
I'm a retired. Sorry, I'll have to call you back.
Always happens, doesn't it?
Of course. I'm a retired United Church of Christ pastor. I served churches for about 35 years. I grew up in Lincoln. I moved away when I was 18, go to college, graduate school, working on the East Coast. And then I started serving churches all over the country. I was an interim often. I got trained to handle conflict. And so I often had to deal with pretty tough situations. Not all, but many. 2 churches with murders in a row. That was a hard time. Meanwhile, I went back to school, got a geology degree, a bachelor's when I was in the early 2000s. I fell in love with, I've always been a science lover. And now I'm working on a degree in climate. So I really want to understand exactly what's changing. And then, of course, how to communicate it.
And of
Which
course,
I'm realizing you don't start with the science, as Dan said, when you have denialists sitting around.
yeah.
You need to find ways to really link with people, values-wise or faith-wise or human-wise, without the science, at least until there's enough trust.
And of course, Penny is an overachiever, as you've soon you've discerned. Penny, we're in the middle of the book of Revelation. We're looking at chapter 5, and I'll kind of remind people where we've been just briefly.
And you're using Craig Kester's book, it looked like?
Yes, we're using Kester's book and also just conversation as well. So, so one of the things we do, just so we don't have phone calls, is that we will mute ourselves during the class. And then when you want to jump in, feel free to just unmute and just say, hey, Dan, I have a question. I can't see everybody in this. I can only see 4 people at a time. So I try to scroll through it to make sure people like Will usually raise their hand, and I can't ever hear Will's hand raised. You know, do not hesitate to jump in and ask a question. This is a pretty fun group that has been together for quite some time at First Presbyterian Church. We are meeting now in honor of one of the members that we lost, and that's John Harrington. Mac had suggested Harrington's Heroes or the Harrington Book Group, but John Harrington is always with us in spirit, and I would just love, you know, it's amazing how many times I think about John and what he might say about whether, you know, what's happening in politics or what's happening in our book discussion. So, Denny, you had mentioned a film, and would you mind telling everybody about that, because I had not heard of
it? The film is a 2018 production, directed by Paul Schrader, the German director, who first debuted, I believe, with the film Taxi Driver many, many years ago. He was raised in a very strict Calvinist church in Germany, has never done a spiritual film before. And what struck me were all of the references or allusions to the book of Revelation, both in him and in the dialogue. And it is a very redemptive film, very contemplative film. I think it's certainly worth your look. You may not agree with me on that, that's fine.
Yeah.
But you do not usually have the opportunity to see a spiritual film that is not full of dogma. And
Yeah.
that is Paul Schrader's goal in producing this film. It's available on Amazon Prime and from many, many different other sources.
And the title is First Reformed.
First Reformed,
Yeah.
2018.
Yeah.
Ethan Hawke.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to check that out. But what I find so gratifying about that is that you're watching the film and you're making connections with what we've been studying in class, and that's wonderful. Well, where we are right now in classes, you know, we've talked about John's revelation, his first image he had in chapter 1, and of course his message to the churches. And now in a kind of a transition, which really marks the turning point in the book, to an introduction to what is about to come, what is about to happen. John is invited up into heaven, you know, in keeping with the apocalyptic visions that we have, you know, seen and read about over the last 2 years, you know, Book of the Watchers, Daniel and Ezekiel. And he's invited through an open door in heaven, and there he witnesses, and he beholds an image that really comes to be foundational for the worship of the church. And this has been one of the great things that I've enjoyed about this. It has reaffirmed for me in, well, maybe in a new way, even just what happens in worship. You know, of course, I'm reading other texts on this as well. But if we get to the conclusion of the slides I have today, this idea that the worship that takes place in heaven is reflected on earth, and then the worship that we participate in on earth is also being participated in heaven. They go hand in hand. So, and prayer the same way. Now, the one thing that's nice about this image is that I don't know if it's just us as Protestants, or just the way I've been raised, but prayer has always been seen as prayers of supplication, right? Well, these prayers are all prayers of adoration and prayers of, you know, of awe and veneration and true worship. We don't see anything about God, please provide this for me. God, please provide this for me. And we've kind of come to rely upon that in terms of prayer. But these are prayers of thanksgiving that we're seeing from this heavenly host. God at the center of the throne, and then of course the Lamb who is introduced, the 4 heavenly creatures, the 7 lamps or lights that are understood to be the Holy Spirit, and then the 24 elders. And then we're going to be introduced, and I think in verse 14 or so, to another ring of myriads and myriads of angels. And when I was reading this image, I kind of thought about, you know, the metaphor or the image that we're often given of, you know, of atoms, right? At the center is the nucleus, then you have these electrons floating around the nucleus, you know, so you have the 4 creatures, you have the 7 lamps, you have the 24 elders, and you go back and back into further rings, but all centered around this image on the throne. And note that the image is not a human image, the image of God, nor is the image of Christ. We're seeing the image of the Lamb, and that's where I'd like to pick up. So I want to start pretty much where we were last time with the vision that John has. Then I saw, and I'm starting chapter 5, verse 6. Then I saw between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders a lamb standing as if it had been slaughtered, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. He went and took the scroll from the right hand of the one who was seated on the throne. And that's the only, that right there is the only anthropomorphic image. He took it from the hand of the one seated on the throne. When he had taken the scroll from the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sing a new song. You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slaughtered, and by your blood you ransomed for God saints from every tribe and language and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests serving our God, and they will reign on earth. That's the hymn. And then moving on in verse 11, then I looked and I heard the voice of many angels surrounding the throne and the living creatures and the elders. They numbered myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands, singing with full voice, worthy is the Lamb that was slaughtered to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. Then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea and all that is in them singing, to the one seated on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever. And the 4 living creatures said, Amen. And the elders fell down and worshiped. Pretty overwhelming image there. You can imagine that Hollywood would do great things with all kinds of special effects with that. But there, at the center of the worship is God and is the Lamb of God. And I mentioned last time that this Lamb is one who seems to have been slain. And I raised the question of how that influenced an early heresy known as Docetism, that Jesus only seemed to be a human being, that he was truly here among us in spirit. The 7 horns and the 7 eyes represent the perfect wisdom, the perfect power, the perfect all-seeing ability of the Lamb itself, and the 7 gifts of the Spirit we talked about from Isaiah. But I wanted to remind us and Mac, before we left last time, you really alluded to this, how the Lamb has served as an image that has that carries its way all through Scripture. And of course, the early Christian church drew upon some of these Old Testament references. I think the first one that we see that's of importance, and I know there are probably others that involve sacrifice. And let me say just what Max said about this, is that John is very peculiar because even in this book, we're going to see that he is open to this idea of the church now being accepting of Gentiles, not just Jews. But John's not giving up, the author of this text is not giving up any of his Judaism. The Jewish rituals are still in effect, and the Jewish imagery is still in effect, and none better and none clearer than this focus on the Lamb, the sacrificial Lamb. Now, Christians have made much of the story of Abraham and Isaac and see it as a precursor or as an early allusion to what God's will for the world was going to be. And this happens in Genesis chapter 22, the story of Abraham, nearly sacrificing his son Isaac. And it's a wonderful story, with rife with dramatic irony, because Isaac doesn't know where the sacrifice is going to come from. Hey, Dad, we're going to go sacrifice something, but what is it? Well, God will provide. And we know that just before Abraham is about to sacrifice his son, his hand is held by the angel, and it's understood as a test. But then a test of Abraham's loyalty, of how much he loved God. But then the worthy sacrifice. God did provide a sacrifice, over in the corner, a lamb's horn or a ram's horns, the male was caught in a thicket. And that becomes the perfect sacrifice. That imagery, by the way, is at the center of the entire Jewish faith when it comes to atonement. That story is the story that's read on the day of Yom Kippur, when all of Israel their sins are atoned for. And the Jewish story goes that, God accounted the righteousness to Abraham because of his willingness to sacrifice his son. Now, what you don't hear in the tale of Genesis, and I think this is a midrash, is that before Abraham agreed to this, he says, oh no, that was pretty nasty what you did, God. And if you want to count it to me as righteousness, I want you to account it to all of my offspring, that they will always, have the opportunity to be accounted as righteous before you. And so this is where, the sacrifice of the lamb, and of course, later on in the Day of Atonement, the Jewish people every year, are able to atone for their sins through, this now symbolic offering of their sins that they've, committed and confessed to each other, and then as a community to God. So the lamb imagery in Genesis, very, very important. And of course, what Mac brought over last time, the Passover lamb, this lamb that comes to be, actually it's not even sacrificed at Passover, but it does later come to be seen as a sacrifice. And then the image from Isaiah 53, the lamb that's led to slaughter, and I should have looked for it before I got started here, but I'll find it quickly enough. Isaiah 53, and this is second Isaiah. So this is a text that was being written when the Jews were being held captive in Babylon. And second Isaiah begins with the text that Pastor Greg actually read this Sunday. Comfort, oh, comfort my people, for they have paid double for their sins. Their slate has been wiped clean. So Isaiah is trying to comfort the Jews and give them some sense of why it is they've just gone through 50 years of this, what appeared to be, God's abandonment, right? And there's a purpose behind it. And this is the introduction of the so-called suffering servant. Now, Christians look at this and say, oh, this is a prefiguration of Christ, who is going to be the suffering servant. But in the context itself, the Lamb is Israel. They have suffered as a result of God's, unknowable plan, incomprehensible plan. And so, the text, he was oppressed and was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By a perversion of justice, he was taken away. And who could have imagined his future? For he was cut off from the land of the living, stricken for the transgressions of my people. They made his grave with the wicked and his tomb with the rich, although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth. Well, we can't read that as Christians and not see a prophecy that relates directly to the crucifixion of Christ. And so this imagery of the Lamb continues in the book of John. And I mentioned this last time, or was it, I can't remember, maybe it was our Sunday school class, where John refers to Christ as the Lamb of God. Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And then even the Jewish letter of Peter, 1 Peter, where he says, he explains the life of Christ and uses this lamb metaphor. And just let me read it. We don't often read 1 Peter, but it is another one of these letters, short letters, reputed to have been written by Peter, written to a Jewish Christian community where this image is central, right? And so this affirmation, you know that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your ancestors, not with perishable things like silver and gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without defect or blemished. He was destined before the foundation of the world, but was revealed at the end of the ages for your sake. The connection here with Peter and what John seems to be saying is really, really, I think, compelling, right? He is, revealed at the end of the age. So I didn't get to talk about that last time. I wanted to go through that rather quickly because, and Mac, being the scholar that he is, picked up on, what wasn't being said. This lamb imagery could not be more Jewish, especially this idea of a people being ransomed. The people of Israel were ransomed from Egypt, and now there's a new ransoming that's happening by virtue of the spilling of the blood of the Lamb. But in that Jewishness, I would like to raise another question. But before we do that, I want to stop and see if there. Yeah, go ahead, Penny.
Yeah, it's Penny. A lot of my ministry, I've really made an effort to walk closely with Jews. I've been to Yom Kippur. Usually I go to Kol Nidre, which is the night before.
Right.
So I don't always go to the Yom Kippur services. This year I did Kol Nidre and then the last service of the day. So I missed what you were talking about. I guess I've always had the sense, well, two things. Number one, when your first comment about we're used to prayers of
supplication.
Supplication, thank you. The Jewish liturgy is filled with adoration.
Yeah.
I've always noticed that there are pages and pages, even if a rabbi doesn't take you to every single prayer in the Shabbat service on a Friday night or a Saturday morning, it's filled with adoration long before there's any supplication at all.
Right.
And it just always struck me that we Protestants in particular have really thrown out that whole part of our legacy because we move so quickly. Maybe there's one praise hymn, and then I served a Presbyterian church for a while out in Clarkson, and they were very concerned to have a prayer of confession every single week, and they wanted personal confession in the prayer, not just corporate confession. So there was very little emphasis on adoration. So that's number one. But number two, I've often sensed that Reformed Jews are a little impatient with the lamb image, feeling as though perhaps it's too close to Christianity whenever I've had conversations about that. So maybe it's more about ancient Israel than it is about current Jews, but I don't, you're more knowledgeable than I, Dan, so tell me what if I'm crazy.
No, well, remember the temple was destroyed in 70 of the Common Era, and the question among Jews was raised, hey, maybe this is part of God's will as well. Do we really need a temple? And if you read, and this is actually my point that I want to make, Penny, because you raise it quite nicely here. Even in the first century, there was this question that was going on. Yeah, the whole blood sacrifice thing, really, I don't, if you read the prophets, especially Amos, I deplore your sacrifices and your blood offerings. I don't want blood. I want righteousness. I want justice, right? And this is certainly the tradition in which Jesus falls. In fact, the liturgy for this Sunday speaks right to this idea. And Greg, I think, is going to preach on Isaiah 65, I believe, or is it 60? Can't remember my numbers very well here. But this emphasis on justice and righteousness and visiting the sick and the poor, this is what God demands of you. This is the sacrifice that God demands. I don't care about blood. I don't want that in the temple. So in the first century, there was that question, even among Jews, and the temple really made it all the more poignant, right? because now they couldn't sacrifice. And now the emphasis was on, well, let us sacrifice ourselves, our individual and corporate wills at the altar of the Torah. Let's do what God requires of us, right? And so the whole question of, you know, the lamb ransoming people through the spilling of blood, and back to Mac's point, this was very Jewish. But was it the kind of Judaism that was, you know, very traditional? I think there were many Jews, and Jesus may have been one of them, who was trying to get away from this idea of the, I tell you truly, you know, I will tear this temple down in 3 days, rebuild it, you know, in a new way. The blood sacrifice is gone. Now Christians have said, well, you know, Jesus was the last sacrifice. Now there is no sacrifice needed. But it's very troubling, this idea of, you know, what we were just talking about, that through the slaughter of a being, a lamb, people are ransomed, or human beings can be ransomed, because what ultimately gives credence to is something called redemptive violence. That if God can bring about the salvation of the world, and we are to model ourselves upon God, then how easy is it for us to use violence and to justify it in, you know, redemptive processes? You know, we have to have war in order to have peace, you know. This image of redemptive violence is one that is really problematic at the core of Christianity. And this is when I want to come back to our theories of atonement. I'll go through the first 3 or 4 that we spoke about last week, but let me stop and see if there are any other questions, because I just saw Penny and Will and Mac. Do you want to say anything, because this is your area?
It's an interesting point to raise as to whether or not this is contemporary Judaism or not, and I have no idea, because I certainly don't know much about contemporary Judaism. But I do know that at the time he was writing, this would have all been something that that Jews would have known. And as we've emphasized before, John was a take no prisoners Jew. He did not want, you know, if you were going to be a Gentile convert, you had to be a Jew convert first, basically. You had to convert to it.
Right.
And, you know, he was not, and we talked about the tension that exists, I think, consciously between John and Paul. And John is always has that in his mind. And,
yeah,
you know, as far as I'm concerned, you know, he's Jewish, and he's also a fanatic, fanatic about it.
And who informs your, is this, I can't remember her name. Who informs this perspective on you? Is it the woman?
I guess,
the woman.
I guess all of them, yeah. Paula, you're not Paula.
Yeah, now you won't be able to remember her name either.
You're right. Pagel.
Elaine Pagels. Elaine
Pagels, right. You know, among others, I guess that's just my general take in the reading that I've done. You know, he is, you know, he's a fundamentalist Jew. But, you know, the Jews would understand these references.
And so much of the sacrificial image has played a role in our current understanding of atonement. Now, like last time before we ended, we talked about these various theories, the ransom theory that Jesus was given to Satan in exchange for all of those souls in Hades. And of course, that is problematic, as well as the Christus Victor, where, you know, Jesus appears to be this perfect human being that Satan wants for himself. But, you know, once he descends into hell, as it says in the Apostles' Creed, he reveals himself as Son of God and binds Satan. Well, there are problems with that as well. Jesus is able, in the 11th and 12th centuries, there was a theory by Anselm called the substitution theory that we talked about, in which Jesus is able to provide satisfaction for the debt that was accrued when human beings fell. In order for God to be repaid what was lost, a perfect man with perfect obedience had to give that honor to God. And that was a very medieval way of looking at things, influenced by, just the medieval court, the importance of giving honor to a king. And then we talked about the moral influence theory, that it's not so much about what we are giving to God, but what God is giving to human beings. That God takes on human flesh and takes on the very thing that God cannot do, and that is suffer and die. A God who dies is not immortal, and all gods are immortal, right? Or a God who dies is mortal, I should say, and all gods need to be immortal. So there's this incredible paradox that happens if you affirm, the godlike nature of Jesus, that he was 100% God and 100% human. This was known as the moral influence theory. If God is willing to demonstrate God's love to such an extent that he becomes bound in body, incarnate as a human being, that he puts aside all sense of self concern to demonstrate God's love for the world, then how much more so ought we to do that? And that was the moral influence theory that we talked about. Now, where things get problematic is with the Reformation, and people like Calvin especially, but this really comes to be this new theory that most people live by now. It's called penal substitution. It was developed in the 19th century at Princeton University, good old Presbyterian Princeton, by a man named Charles Hodge. And this is the one that focuses on a very American view of justice. And I want to emphasize here that the word justice does not necessarily need to involve some sort of violence, right? The Old Testament understanding of justice is to create a community in which there is equity, in which there are the orphan is cared for, the widow, in which there is a sense of harmony and peace. The Jewish word that you probably all know is shalom. Unfortunately, this idea of justice as required by God, if God is a just God, then somebody needs to be punished for what happened in the garden, right? And damn it all, human beings are, that punishment isn't, well, I should say, someone needs to be punished for it. But because of God's love, God is going to be the one who's going to take on the punishment, right? So God's justice requires penal substitution. There needs to be somebody punished. But God's mercy, on the other hand, is what gives him the opportunity to take on that human form and take on the punishment himself. Now, this is very, very powerful, right? And it's a form of the atonement. And it's one that really convinced me when I was in seminary, because that wonderful paradox, justice and mercy going together hand in hand. Until I read a man by the name of Rene Girard. And Rene Girard, Rene, and Rene Girard really put a new thought into my head about this. And that is this idea that if violence is what is required to redeem the world, then we will never be able to rid ourselves of the violence that stands at, in contradistinction to the shalom of the kingdom. The shalom of the kingdom should not have as part of it. I mean, it's a wonderful image of a lion lying down, or a wolf lying down with a lamb, and, all violence ceasing. But in order to bring that about, we require a violent sacrifice. And this is a really interesting question. Let me just stop, okay, and see if you're all with me on the whole penal substitution theory, because I want to move on from that, but I want to invite questions or responses to penal substitution.
Well, I will just say, as a pastor, many of us joke about how we're serving people who are fundamentalist light. So most everyone in our congregations would say that Jesus died for my sins.
Yeah.
And that's not a view that I personally get excited about. And I know this is the framework of atonement.
Right.
I tend to believe
Sacrifice.
the new fundamentalism that, of course, was born in the early 1900s, which continues as a very loud voice in our culture, keeps that before all of us. But I'm not sure, penal substitution, I've forgotten about Hodge. Is that the real source of our fundamentalist light view that probably is held by many in our churches?
Well, it's certainly, it's certainly present in Calvin as well. But I really became adamant about this when I attended a Missouri Synod Lutheran Maundy Thursday service. And the whole service was about the wrath of God, Jesus taking on the wrath of God, wrath. I just kept saying to myself, yeah, because God is wrath. Didn't make sense, does it? I mean, we know God is love. So where does the wrath of God fit into this? And this is where Girard is so interesting. Rene Girard is a contemporary, died recently, an anthropologist. But Girard says at the core of all human interaction, there's something called mimesis, wanting to have what somebody else has, and entering into aggressive relationships in order to have that. Think of little kids playing in a daycare, right? There's thousands of toys around. But which toy does your little kid want to play with? Well, it's the toy that his friend is playing with, right? Hey, you got all these other toys. Well, that's what mimesis. I want what he has. Well, when that creates problems in a society, then you find a way to resolve that. And the way that has been resolved throughout human history, according to Girard, was through something called a scapegoat. You find a third party upon whom you can place the blame for all of the violence, all of the aggression that is the result of this, mimesis, the result of this discord that's been created. And so stories are told to help justify the sacrifice of a third party in order to create, in order to wipe the slate clean, and you can go back to a harmonious relationship once again. And this happens in culture after culture after culture, says Girard. The thing that is so extraordinary about the story of Jesus is that for the first time, and this really isn't theology, it's anthropology and it's literary criticism, but for the first time in the history of the human race, the story that justified scapegoating was told from the perspective of the scapegoat. Let me just say that again. For the first time in human history, the myth, the narrative used throughout societies that justified scapegoating was told from the perspective of the innocent victim. And that gives a revelation to the world that redemptive violence is not possible, that violence only perpetuates violence. Nowhere has a scapegoat been able to, completely remove violence from the world, especially when you want to place the redemption of the world that is going to bring about peace. If that is brought about through violence, then peace will never be found. So I'd really love to hear what our anthropologist, Denny Storr, thinks about this. You got a look of consternation on your face. I hope I've explained that well. What kind of comments do you have about this? thought?
It's above my pay grade. Seriously, this is really heady stuff, and
Yeah.
I rely on your explanation.
Well, it is heady stuff, and Gerard is not easy to read. I really have to rely upon his interpreters. But at the core of this, and there's a man by the name of Walter Wink, a theologian, who's really written quite nicely on this. He wrote a book called The Powers That Be. And he basically exposes how the powers that be use the scapegoating theory in order to justify violence in the world. And what Wink says is that Christ comes, and his whole mission is one to try to undermine the violence that's standing in the way of the kingdom of God. Now, what we're looking at here in the book of John, or excuse me, in the Revelation of John, I am going to bring it back to the Revelation of John, is this wonderful image of the harmony, of the worshipful harmony that's found in heaven. But the thing that is going to make that worshipful harmony apparent on earth is going to be the sacrifice, the slaughter of this lamb and the spilling of this blood in order to ransom the world. This is Mac's Jewish idea. This is how atonement took place in ancient Judaism, right? This is how atonement took place in any tradition that uses sacrifice. We are going to use a scapegoat, and it is going to spill its blood, and the sacrifices just continue and continue and continue. Is this what the prophets were saying when God speaks through Amos and says, I despise your solemn festivals. I don't want blood sacrifice. I want righteousness. I want justice. And the unheard trope in that is, and righteousness and justice will never be brought about through violent means. This is one of the new atonement theories that we have. And it stands, I think, in contrast to what we see presented here in the book of Revelation.
Hey, Dan, this is Al.
Yeah, Al.
This kind of sounds like it's related to the just war theory of, that was certainly referred to in the past, some of our wars that we got tied into.
Yep, exactly, Al. If you create a paradigm that says that violence is the way that you ultimately create peace, and if that's how God does it, and we're created in the image of God, and we're supposed to follow the example of God, then what do we end up doing, right? Well, we, instead of following diplomatic means, war is the answer here. It's only through war that peace is going to be brought about. Well, how's that working for us? And this is why the emphasis of many theologians now is on what we might call a nonviolent atonement, an atonement that does not have violence at its core. You can't get more violent than that image that I'm posting, right, and in the PowerPoint presentation. This is why this the Eisenheim altarpiece is so arresting. It looks at a racked body of the scapegoat, the blood, and you can't see it in this image, but at the foot of this cross is the image of a lamb that looks pretty much like this, a lamb from whose heart blood is being spilled into the chalice. So this has ramifications for the way we celebrate the Eucharist as well. In some traditions, the Eucharist is a re-sacrificing of Christ to God, the spilling of Christ's blood.
I guess one thing I would wonder about, though, I wonder if the author here, I noticed it and I really haven't resolved it. I hadn't thought of it before today. I wonder if the author is trying, of our text in Revelation, is trying to hint towards the change by looking for a lion, but instead he sees a lamb.
Oh, very interesting. Yeah.
So I don't know the significance of that. So it occurred to me maybe, I mean, the book you had us read, Kohler, is it, or Kaler, whatever his name is, Craig Kaler?
Oh,
Craig
Kester,
Kohler.
Craig Kester, yeah.
Kester, I'm so sorry. He makes it, he points it out. I mean, I saw it myself and then I saw it. So I'm not sure what to make of it, but.
Right, right. Well, the Lion of Judah we talked about a little bit, and then is at one and same time the Lamb. And right, it does give you this intimation, you might say, of what is to come, of the Lion and the Lamb lying down together. So, well, let me see if there are any other people who'd like to say something here.
Dan?
Yeah, Denny? Then Will.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting that in anthropological literature, the whole idea of scapegoating simply does not exist as a cultural norm in hunting and gathering, small scale herding societies until the invention of agriculture in the Middle East in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley.
Exactly.
About 10,000 years ago, which is the theme of the really, really cool book I'm reading right now, Ishmael, which was published about 25 years ago, on takers and givers.
Oh. Do you all know that text, Ishmael? It's a conversation with an ape, basically, and he is a sage who is explaining just what Denny is talking about, where our separation from creation took place. And the idea is that hunter and gatherer cultures did not produce sacrifices. They understood that they held all things in common, but with the invention of agriculture, and then I would say also cities that were built, walled structures in order to protect the products of that agriculture, that's when the mimesis comes in.
And
I want what those people have.
Wealth, which it permitted.
I'm sorry, Denny, I was talking.
And the accumulation of wealth, which is another way of what you're saying.
Yep, yep. And that, when conflict arose between these cities, one of the best ways to resolve the conflict was to find the cause of the conflict, who was usually somebody who was innocent. Now think about this as an anthropological theory that explains some of our race relations today. This idea of mimesis and scapegoating has not gone away, And this is why Girard's emphasis on Christ as a nonviolent Messiah is so important. It has so many ramifications. As Al's pointing out, just war theory. Will, you wanted to say something, and I hope I'm not missing other people in here.
Go ahead and give others a chance first.
Classic Will Locke right there.
Okay.
Go ahead, Will.
So some of you know this, I've just finished Peter Matheson's The Snow Leopard for the second time, and he's struggling with Buddhist concepts, struggling mightily, and I don't sense in his writing, and I'm not an expert on Buddhism at all, I don't see that scapegoating concept in Buddhism. Could you because you know a lot more about it, could you contrast Buddhist thinking and the scapegoating that you're talking about here?
Right, and it depends on what Buddhism you're talking about. There are sacrificial rituals that take place in Theravada Buddhism, but that's a result of a syncretism between some indigenous beliefs in Thailand, especially, and Buddhism itself. But if you get to the original philosophy of Buddhism, the idea is one that this world is a world of suffering, and suffering is always going to take place. And the ultimate goal of the Bodhisattva is to relieve the world of that suffering through trying to demonstrate to people, what's really happening. The world is suffering. Suffering is caused by desire. There's that mimesis idea, right? There's something I want that I can't have. If you remove desire from the equation, guess what? You remove suffering from the equation as well. So how do I live in a way that is ego-less, that helps me to emphasize that, you know, we're all a part of this, you know, communal experience together, and that suffering is what is causing, you know, or that desire is what is causing all of the suffering in the world. Teach people how to remove desire from their lives, how to live in an ego-less or a self-less way. I'll use ego there because that's really the right word. And then you can remove suffering from the world. And as you might imagine, Buddhists are very focused on nonviolence, right? Now there are examples of Buddhists, especially in Myanmar recently, you know, becoming part of a violent response to political situations. But for the most part, Buddhism has also been this nonviolent. Now this is all, you know, hippy dippy stuff to a lot of people, right? What do you mean, Jesus? Because we get caught up in, you know, America is Christian, and a Christian America has been the savior of the world through our military. And don't try to tell me that we shouldn't be, you know, violent, because that's what Jesus says. And you'll get a lot of people who really oppose this, you know. But the question I keep asking is this: is John in the book of Revelation perpetuating a sacrifice theory that Jesus himself perhaps tried to de-emphasize? You know, and it's really hard to say, but you know, like like Denny has pointed out, this is really above our pay grade as lay Christians. But these are where some of the more complex theological conversations are happening in academia right now. Has our atonement theory just created more problems than it's worth? And so Gerard would say, yes, it has. All right, one last comment from somebody. Can I, Dwight or Jane or Matt? Rich? Ann, yes.
Dan?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm about to probably offend some people here. But when we said that this business with scapegoating started with agricultural societies,
Yeah.
we never see anything like that in Nebraska, of course, which has basically a farm economy.
Yeah, right. You know, well, it's really interesting. I think a lot of that scapegoating happens symbolically through our reverence for football.
I think you're absolutely right.
And that's what you're alluding to, I think, right?
Not just football, but yeah, football. Yeah, certainly it happens that way.
Yeah.
And I think it used to be more obvious, like in the 70s and in the 80s, this competition between Nebraska and is it Oklahoma?
Yeah,
and
right. Yeah, sure.
I mean, I was surprised that there wasn't, you know, blood spilled in the stands after every one of those matches. But
right,
yeah.
Right. Yeah, exactly. and that's a scapegoating ritual where there, you know, it never gets resolved. There's always going to be another one that's coming up. But you know, the whole stadium idea and the field itself as the altar, and then you've got your mythic heroes out there fighting the narrative battle, you know, and tell me when Nebraska loses, I mean, the whole universe is shaken, isn't it? It's the myth does not hold. The gods have not shown their grace upon us, and probably getting further afield. Yeah, go ahead.
Did you call on me?
Okay. Yeah.
I was thinking also about the recent thing about the death penalty. You know, we had abolished it, and there's just this You know, we have to have the death penalty. You know, we know it's not a deterrent. We know it doesn't save anything. And yet there's just this bloodlust that we have to kill somebody.
Right. And why not? Because that's how God, reconciled the world to himself, through the death penalty. So don't try to tell me that we shouldn't have a death penalty when God obviously has justified it in the, you'll see all that stuff. I saw 2 bumper stickers on a car once, and on the left it said, "Saved by the grace of God." On the right it said, "Do the crime, do the time." but this idea of justice as justice that's meted out, that has probably some sort of violent aspect to it. I'm afraid this is probably taking us further afield than we needed to go in the book of Revelation, but it was a perfect jumping off point, I think, because this does stand at the center, not only of our understanding of how to worship God, but what lies at the center of that worship of God is the Lamb who was slain in order to ransom the cosmos, and who overcame death. Beautiful imagery, but the implications of God, first of all, needing a sacrifice. That whole question of God requires us to, forgive each other, not just 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. Yet, according to our theology, ostensibly, God cannot forgive the world for, the fall just 1 time, right? So we're caught up on all kinds of very difficult questions here. And I hope I'm not confusing people to the extent of, shattering or undermining some of the foundations of your faith, but this is what theologians do. They think of the implications of some of the theories that we arrive at, and how is that going to play out in our society? And I just wonder what the penal substitution theory, what fruit it has produced in our, if I can call it that, in our society. Our time is almost on us. I want to know if there's anybody else who would like to make a comment.
Dan, I don't know if I'm on or not. Am I on?
Yes, you are. Please.
Okay. Anyway, Aeschylus deals with this in the Trinity, the Orestean Trinity, beginning with Agamemnon and everything. And those 3 plays put together a finally jury system at the end of it, where justice is arrived at. And it's divinely brought in by, I think, as I remember it, it's Athena who implements the justice system that Athens was very proud of. And the Furies, who are the gods who are, the one crime begets another crime.
Right.
The Furies go into the ground at the end of that. And they're given a different function, and it becomes a function of overseeing agriculture kind of thing.
Yeah. Right.
And I always found that a really interesting way of dealing with it. And it's Aeschylus was really, I think, profound in not having tit for tat as the way of judging.
Not only that, but 2,300 years later, it would be the very foundation of our American democracy. We're not going to hand over issues of justice to the church and deal with ideas like sin, retribution, and things like that. We are going to establish, our jury system, right? Assumed innocent until proven guilty, and we are going to allow human reason to determine what justice is in this respect. And that's where we, have this tension, and it's still in our society. What do we have? We used to have what are called penitentiaries, right? Well, that's the theological emphasis. And now we have correctional facilities.
Oh,
this understanding that, you know, human error can be somehow resolved through education, and not so much through retribution, but through rehabilitation, you know. Really, really interesting stuff. And, you know, I'm sorry we only have an hour to flesh this out. A little incarnational reference there. So, well, well, thank you, everyone. And yeah, thank you, Penny, for joining us. It's nice having you. And, you know, if we know of other people who would like to join, I hope everyone is okay with the idea that this is an open conversation.
There is a good Girard scholar in Nebraska who's a UCC pastor serving in church in Oglala and Brule. She knows Girard quite well.
He knows, oh, okay.
Lisa Hale is her name.
Oh, great.
I talked to her. I've only read some of Girard and know him some. And mainly through a theologian who used to be at Andover Newton. I don't know what happened to him, but he really helped him come alive for me. Or something. You probably know who that is now.
I don't know. I'll need to know more about that, though, because I'd like to at least have a conversation to partner about Girard. So, well,
Lisa's your woman.
Okay, that's good, because I currently don't have a woman. So, just kidding, just kidding. And nothing like ending on an inappropriate note. So, same bat time, same bat channel next week. And we will move ahead into chapter 6. A few things I want to say about the end of chapter 5 that I didn't get to today, but we're still in Kester's 3rd chapter, I believe. But we're going to look at Revelation chapter 6, and here's where things start to heat up a little bit. So,
thank you, Dan.
Yeah, thank
you,
you.
Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you.
Good seeing everybody.
I'm sorry I talked too much.
Not at all. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See ya.
How do I